Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, there was a moo cow coming down along the road. And this moo cow that was coming down along the road met a nice's little boy named Baby Tuckoo. My uncle, James Joyce, was born on 2nd February 1882 here at 41 Brighton Square, Terranure, a southern suburb of Dublin. His parents, John Stanislaus, known to his friends as Jack, and May, had but recently moved into the newly built red brick house. The square is sedate, eminently respectable, and typical of many such Dublin Victorian developments. The houses were peopled by young middle-class couples settling into their secure backgrounds, raising their children, paying their bills, and looking forward to lives of blameless anonymity. Ostensibly, Jack Joyce fitted into this general background. He came from a well-connected, long-established Cork family. He had an income of £815, made up of salary and private means. A reasonably handsome sum for the time. It was not handsome enough for Jack Joyce. He had extravagant tastes and a cavalier attitude towards money, be it his own or other people's. His profligacy was in time to rock and finally sink the family boat, as his eldest son was to rock the establishment boat in due course. But for the moment, the Joyce family lived in relatively quiet seclusion in Terranure. In his last recorded letter to his now famous son on 31st January 1931, my grandfather wrote, "I wonder do you recollect the old days in Brighton Square when you were baby Tuckoo, and I used to take you out in the square and tell you all about the moo cow that used to come down from the mountain and take little boys across." In 1884, the family moved to a larger house at 23 Castlewood Avenue, Rathmines. The second son, Stanislaus, was born here on 18th December of that year. He was to come closest to James of all the children, follow him into exile, and become in so many ways, as his book claims, my brother's keeper. In May 1887, the Joyce family moved to number 1, the End House at Martello Terrace in Bray. Bray was a popular middle-class seaside resort, 12 miles south of Dublin, very acceptable to Jack Joyce because of its proximity to the sea, which he loved, and because of the distance it put between himself and his in-laws, whom he hated. James Joyce lived a happy, normal childhood here. He was known in the family as Sonny Jim. The happy times were not to last. Jack Joyce's festering financial problems came to a head. He had been living well beyond his means, entertaining lavishly, drinking heavily, and employing up to 4 servants and a governess for the children. In 1892, he lost his job and was put on pension. And in 1892 also, the family moved to 23 Carrisford Avenue, Blackrock, to be the family's last fashionable Southside address. The stay here was to be very short. Early in 1893, the 2 large yellow caravans, described by James Joyce in his autobiographical novel, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, brought the family possessions across the Liffey to the unmentionable north side. The family's own particular odyssey had begun. On the north side, the decline in family fortunes continued. Jack Joyce led his family through a succession of houses of diminishing fashion and respectability, all the while proudly bearing his own prized family portraits. The frequency of the moves did not in any way lessen the pain and humiliation suffered by the children. James, meanwhile, became more determined to devote his life to art and divorce himself from his family and country. His brother Stanley remembers a scene where James is explaining a play to his parents. He said, "The subject of the play is genius breaking out in the home and against the home. You needn't have gone to see it. It's going to happen in your own house."
From Bray, where the Joyces were still living a prosperous life, the young James Joyce was sent at the age of 6½ to Clongoweswood College, Sallins in County Kildare. Clongoweswood was and still is a celebrated Roman Catholic boarding school, indeed the leading school of its kind in Ireland. At this college, Joyce would have received an education appropriate to the young sons of the gentry. And it is here they encountered games like cricket, beautifully caught in a portrait of the artist, where he catches the sounds of the cricket balls, pick, pack, pock, puck, like drops of water falling faintly in the brimming bowl. It was here also that on the day that he was left at the gate of the castle by his father gave him the advice always to be a gentleman, Stevie, and never to peach on another fellow. He then found that the family fell into some difficulties, the fortunes declined, and Joyce had to be removed because of the family's inability to pay the school fees. There was then a period of about a year where Joyce attended the O'Connell schools run by the Christian Brothers, and the evidence suggests that Joyce was not pleased by this association with what he called Paddy Stink and Mickey Mudd. One morning, John Stanislaus Joyce, Joyce's father, encountered the rector of Belvedere, Father John Conmee, at the corner of Mountjoy Square. They discussed the future of the young boy, and Father Conmee agreed to arrange to have James Joyce and his younger brother Stanislaus educated free at Belvedere College, here in the heart of inner Dublin. Here at Belvedere, Joyce continued his association with the Jesuits. And although it was also at this period that Joyce began to shed his orthodox religious belief, he continued to show an affection and respect for the completeness of Jesuit logic and its coherence as a religious system. I also think it very likely that in the beauty of these surroundings, Joyce came for the first time across the germ of the idea of Ulysses, when he must have been confronted on many occasions with the spectacle of small, snotty-nosed schoolboys tumbling down staircases like these, past the frozen disapproval of Diana, Apollo, and Venus, and the other great classical deities that adorn the stucco-work of 18th century Dublin. Joyce continued his education here under the tutelage of the Jesuits, at Newman House, founded by John Henry Cardinal Newman, Anglican convert to Catholicism, who established here the Catholic University of Ireland. And it pleased Joyce to think that the sombre halls of Newman House echoed still to the cloistral, silver-veined prose of the Cardinal. It was here in the old physics theatre of Newman House that the Literary and Historical Society met during Joyce's period as a student. And it was here that he also read his paper on drama and life, a paper intellectually adventurous for its time, in which he challenged the orthodoxy and promoted the ideas of Ibsen. This was too much for some of Joyce's fellow students, who felt that if they had to have art at all, what they wanted was art that elevated national art and, above all, moral art. Such was not for Joyce. Joyce also records in A Portrait of the Artist how it was in this room that he encountered the Dean of Studies attempting to light a fire, and a debate began between them concerning the word tundish, which was unfamiliar to the English-born Jesuit priest, leading the young Stephen Dedalus to speculate about the difference in the way in which an English person speaks English as compared to the way in which an Irish person speaks English. As Joyce was to write, "My soul frets in the shadow of his language." The National Library in Kildare Street constituted a kind of informal extension to Joyce's university education, which took place in Newman House on Stephen's Green. It was here that J.F. Byrne, the Cranley of A Portrait of the Artist, sent for esoteric works on veterinary medicine, such as The Diseases of the Ox, which in the library section of Joyce's Ulysses he has found reading. On the steps outside the library, Joyce and friends discussed politics, religion, culture, and aesthetics in a form of Socratic dialogue. Thank you. Bewley's Oriental Cafe in Westmoreland Street, Dublin's equivalent of the Augustan tea houses and coffee shops of 18th century London, patronised by Dr. Johnson, Garrick and Goldsmith, provided yet another informal forum in which Joyce could display the fertility of his imagination and the range of his ideas. And indeed, Joyce's close friend, Constantine Curran, remembered in a book of memoirs how Joyce used often to astonish the other customers of Bewley's Cafe by holding forth at some length in a brilliant soliloquy on the nature of art and aesthetics.
Dubliners, Joyce's first major prose work, was written not to exalt the city, but to represent it as it was in all its meanness. For his settings, he did not choose the much-vaunted Georgian squares or the great houses. Instead, he chose the inner city where he had been brought up, the small houses, back alleys and side streets. These were to provide the newfound raw material for his stories. This house at number 15 Usher's Island is typical of Joyce's social milieu. It's the setting for his most famous short story, The Dead. The Mrs. Morkan who held their dance here were tenants of a corn factor and lived in rooms on the upper floor. Of all the stories in Dubliners, it is in this one perhaps that Joyce is kindest to his characters, portraying them at their poor but convivial best. In other stories, Dubliners are seen living petty, stunted lives, their dreams frustrated by the realities of poverty, convention and family ties. You could do nothing in Dublin, muses little Chandler as he crosses Grattan Bridge. He looked down the river towards the lower quays and pitied the poor, stunted houses. They seemed to him a band of tramps, huddled together along the river banks, their old coats covered with dust and soot, stupefied by the panorama of sunset, and waiting for the first chill of night to bid them arise, shake themselves and be gone. In a portrait of the artist as a young man, Joyce describes how the city of Dublin was a new and complex sensation for the 10-year-old Stephen. In the beginning, he contented himself with circling timidly round the neighbouring square, or, at most, going halfway down one of the side streets. But when he had made a skeleton map of the city in his mind, he followed boldly one of its central lines until he reached the Custom House. Behind me is Custom House Quay, where an older and more intoxicated Stephen was rescued by Leopold Bloom and brought to the cabman's shelter in Ulysses. Just a couple of streets behind the Custom House, between here and the house where the boy was growing up, was the most notorious brothel quarter in Europe, the area which Joyce calls Night Town, a maze of narrow streets where Mrs. Mack, May Oblong and Bella Cohen ran their houses. It was here that Joyce's sexual experience began when he was little more than 14. Only a few blocks separated the Kips from the middle-class respectability of the Joyce's Northside homes. Somewhere on the borderline was Mrs. Mooney's boarding house in Hardwick Street, where the resident young men referred to the landlady as the Madam.
In a portrait of the artist as a young man, Stephen Dedalus, James Joyce's alter ego, walks down Garden Street past the Jesuit church and the Jesuit house attached to it, fantasizing about his possible life as a Jesuit, as the Reverend Stephen Dedalus, S.J., and speculates as to which window in the Jesuit house will be his. The church here is also the church presided over by Father Purdon in Joyce's short story, Grace. In this story, Joyce parodies the parable in the New Testament in which Jesus Christ scourges the moneylenders out of the temple. In Joyce's variation on this story, Father Purdon, ironically, invites the moneylenders and money changers of Dublin's 19th century commercial life back into the church, bids them be comfortable, assures them that the Lord Jesus Christ is not a harsh taskmaster, and establishes himself as their spiritual accountant, suggesting that he will be able to cook their books for them in a moral sense. Joyce's attitude towards this view of life is indicated clearly in the name he gives to the priest, Father Purdon, because Purdon Street was the principal axis of the brothel area that then flourished in Dublin's 19th century life. In all of Joyce's fiction, he dwells lovingly on the ritual, the ceremonial, even the smells of Catholicism. And this is an interest and a fascination that remained with him throughout his life.
Happy are we who are called to his supper. Lord, I am not worthy to receive you, but only say the word, and I shall be. May the body and blood of Christ bring us all to a life that will never end.
Stately plump Buck Mulligan came from the stairhead, bearing a bowl of lather on which a mirror and a razor lay crossed. The famous beginning of a famous book. This was Ulysses, James Joyce's most popular novel. Here, Stephen Dedalus heard the sea hailed as a great sweet mother by the well-fed voice beside him, and saw, bull-like, the ring of bay and skyline holding a dull green mass of liquid. Stephen stood up and went over to the parapet. Leaning on it, he looked down on the water and on the mailboat clearing the harbour mouth of Kingstown. Our mighty mother, Buck Mulligan said. Stephen is Joyce's own portrait of himself as a young man. The Martello Tower at Sandycove, 10 miles from the city centre, is part of a defence system against Napoleon, built in 1804. Joyce stayed here for a short while as the guest of his friend Oliver Gogarty, a poet and medical student. The tower, now a world-famous Joyce museum, was the springboard from which the novel launched itself into a single day in the life of Dublin. As Stephen rises in Sandycove, so Joyce's other chief protagonist, Leopold Bloom, begins his odyssey in the heart of the city. Stephen's journey from the brightness of the seaside leads him into town for his encounter with Bloom. Leopold Bloom is the great all-round man of world literature. We know more about him than we do about Hamlet, or even Sherlock Holmes. We know his height, his weight, his diet, and his most intimate thoughts and habits. This is Bloom's day. There is a pork kidney for breakfast, a letter from his daughter in Mullingar, a purchase of lemon soap, and a journey to a friend's funeral. Each of the 18 chapters of Ulysses has a theme based on episodes from Homer's Odyssey. This is Hades, a visit to the underworld, a chapter naturally preoccupied with death and the dead.
Mr. Bloom walked unheeded along his grove by saddened angels. Crosses, broken pillars, family vaults, stone hopes praying with upcast eyes, old Ireland's hearts and hands. The gates glimmered in front, still open. Back to the world again. Enough of this place. Brings you a bit nearer every time.
Lunchtime cues another chapter, Les Dragonians, which takes the appropriate theme of food. In Wandering Rocks, Bloom is stationary as the people of Dublin swirl about him. He is an outsider. No one calls him by his first name. A Jew by blood, a Protestant by birth, a Catholic by marriage, he is everything and nothing.
I figured that Joyce chose to make the central character of Ulysses, Bloom, a Jew, because he felt that as a Jew, Bloom represented somebody who was a part of society and apart from society at the same time. Because Bloom would have been considered by his fellow Dubliners and his fellow countrymen as a sort of an exotic creature, an alien in their midst. And at the same time, Bloom would have been not considered a proper Jew by Jews, by Orthodox Jews, because his mother wasn't Jewish. And therefore, he represented to Joyce the ultimate outsider, rejected, if you like, by both parts of society, mildly rejected by both parts of society. Therefore, in a way, Joyce identified with this aspect of Bloom because as an artist, he felt persecuted by society and exiled from society, and being a lapsed Catholic in Ireland, he probably felt the same. Good puzzle would be cross Dublin without passing a pub.
Some 60 licensed premises are identified in the pages of Joyce's novel. Mulligan's, although belonging strictly more to Dubliners than to Ulysses, best typifies the classic Joycean hostelry. Challenging in its complexity, but alluring in its wealth of detail, Ulysses derives its raw material from the people and city of Dublin. It's a book where the trivial and commonplace are elevated to the status of myth and symbol. The action encompasses a single day and a single city. Within these confines of time and space, the movements of hundreds of characters are scrupulously synchronized around the odyssey of two central characters. Ineluctable modality of the visible, at least that of no more, thought through my eyes. This is space, which with its companion time, the ineluctable modality of the audible, are the qualities which entrap Joyce's characters in the net of their environment and circumstances.
Yes, it was her he was looking at, and there was meaning in his look. His eyes burned into her, as though they would read her very soul. Wonderful eyes they were, superbly expressive. But could you trust them? People were so queer. She could see at once by his dark eyes and his pale, intellectual face that he was a foreigner. The image of the photo she had of Martin Harvey, the matinee idol, only for the moustache. And she saw a long Roman candle going up over the trees, up, and in the tense hush they were all breathless with excitement as it went higher, higher, almost out of sight, and she had to lean back more and more to look up after it, high, high. And he had a full view high up above her knee, and she wasn't ashamed, and he wasn't either, to look in that immodest way. And he went on looking.
At the end of the day, Leopold Bloom returns here to Eccles Street. His home at number 7 has since been destroyed. However, these houses on the other side of the street look pretty much the way his did. In fact, these area steps and railings could very well be the ones over which he and Stephen Dedalus climbed at 2 o'clock in the morning when they were trying to tiptoe into the house, while Leopold Bloom's wife, Molly, lay waiting upstairs, the green-eyed monster, as he referred to her. In fact, I don't believe that there's any author before or since who has done such justice to womanhood as Joyce did in Molly Bloom, because he presented us with a completely full human being, with a character who was all things, all human things. He allowed her to be generous, voluptuous, thoughtful, provocative, earthy, petty, mean, angry, jealous, humorous, cantankerous. He allowed her all these human emotions. And of course, the reason that he could see that this was so essential was because he wanted to create something that was like the full earth ball, as he once described her. She is his great tribute to womanhood. And of course, she is the great tribute that he made to the one woman with whom he lived for almost 40 years, his wife, Nora Barnacle Joyce. James Joyce first met Nora Barnacle here on Nassau Street in 1904 when she sauntered into his life. She was working here at what was then Finn's Hotel, a second-class lodging house. She'd run away from Galway in the west of Ireland from her family home due to the cruelty of her uncle, and she'd made her way here to the city, which was a very courageous thing to do in those days. Joyce was intrigued by her. She was quite different from the young ladies that he knew, the middle-class young ladies like the Sheehy girls who were educated, and of course very different from the whores of Nighttown where he sometimes spent his evenings. So he made a date with her, but she didn't turn up. He was very disappointed, and he wrote to her, rather prophetically, "I may be blind. I looked for a long time at a head of reddish-brown hair and decided it was not yours. I would like to make an appointment if you have not forgotten me." Well, she hadn't forgotten him, and so they made a second date for June 16th, 1904. And years later, Joyce was to honor her and how meaningful the events of that day were for both of them by making June 16th the day for all the events in his novel Ulysses. They arranged their rendezvous for the outside of the former residence of Sir William Wilde, the surgeon. Just lending a literary twist to things, of course, he was Oscar's father. You know, Nora Barnacle and James Joyce were to spend a lot of years together, almost 40. When Joyce's father found out that her name was Barnacle, he's reputed to have said, well, she'll never leave him, and she never did. Very shortly after their meeting, of course, they were to elope and leave Dublin. And through the mouth of this harbour, here is how they left, on their way to Paris and the fortunes that lay before them.
When Joyce left Dublin at the turn of the century to go into voluntary exile, his decision to do so was motivated largely by the difficulties he was encountering in securing publication for his first book, a volume of short stories called Dubliners. Some idea of these difficulties can be given if one remembers an interview that the publisher, George Roberts, gave in the early 1950s. When asked by the interviewer if he remembered James Joyce, Roberts said, "Remember Joyce? Indeed I do. And sure, why wouldn't I? Wasn't he forever hopping around borrowing money from everyone in Dublin? Well, I remember one day in 1904, and Mr. Joyce came hopping around on the usual errand, looking for the lender 2 quid. Well, I gave him 4, and he going away with some woman, 'cause I thought 'twould be cheap at the price to be shut of them." And indeed, this disparaging attitude towards Joyce existed also at the upper end of the social scale. Here in this beautiful house in North Great George's Street lived Sir John Pentland Mahaffey, Provost of Trinity College and tutor of Oscar Wilde. Mahaffey said, speaking of Joyce and George Moore, "Thank God they have both cleared out of Dublin. but not before they had squirted stink upon all the decent people like a pair of skunks. James Joyce is a living argument in defense of my contention that it was a mistake to establish a separate university for the aboriginals of this island.
On the 5th of January 1920, James Joyce wrote a postcard from Trieste to his Aunt Josephine in Dublin to ask whether there are trees and of what kind behind the Star of the Sea church in Sandymount visible from the shore, and also whether there are steps at the side of it leading down from Leahy's Terrace. The shoreline has long since changed, but 5 trees still stand in the terrace as described in Ulysses. This request was typical of the many sent to her and to other Dubliners for the wealth of detailed information, which was to enable Joyce, in his own words, to give us a picture of Dublin so complete that if the city one day suddenly disappeared from the earth, it could be reconstructed from the pages of my book. Joyce began writing Ulysses 2 years after he had left Dublin for the last time, and 10 years after the events it describes. He used maps, street directories, newspaper reports, and his own prodigious memory to recreate the city of his youth. So precise was he that practically all the events in Ulysses can be identified to within a few yards. Writing in exile gave him not only a perspective, but a challenge to rebuild Dublin with real streets, real shops, real people, and real events. He could only write about Dublin from a distance, detached and uninvolved. In his mind, it was frozen forever as he left it. And throughout his life, writing in several cities in Europe, Dublin was his only setting.
As a young man, James Joyce stated his intention to fly by the family net, and in this he at least partially succeeded. Other members of the family escaped in various ways, 2 through early death, 1 by joining a nunnery, 2 by going into exile, and 2 sisters, including my mother, through marriage. But 2 members of the family who remained firmly enmeshed in that net were my aunts, Eva and Florrie, who spent 20 years of their lives in a flat here at number 12 Mountjoy Square. Tiny and fragile, vulnerable and fearful, they were filled with resentment towards their father. They could not remember, but had been told of the good times in Turnure and Bray. But they remembered with bitterness the horrors of their own lives. That bitterness spilled over against their brother James, who had revealed the sordid details of their lives to the world. Gone was the play-acting, gentle, amiable eldest brother known as Sonny Jim, and replaced by a spectre whose shadow darkened their lives even from abroad. Paranoid as they grew older, they saw only the pointing finger and imagined slight. They constantly warned me of letting people know of my connection with the writer, and endeavoured at all time to keep their own relationship secret. Practically recluses, I remember they used to check the time by telescope with the clock on Findlater's church. Victims because they thought they were victims, but victims nonetheless. Pappy, as his children called John Stanislaus Joyce, saw his dreams for his brilliant son in ruins. The elopement with Norah Barnacle shattered him, or what was left of him, and he saw, as he wrote, a life of promise crossed and a future that might have been brilliant blasted in one breath. According to my mother, he never finished any of his son's books, but he soon forgave his favourite child, as he always had. He lived for 27 years after Jim's elopement and wrote many letters complaining about his daughter's neglect and his own lack of funds to Zurich, Trieste and Paris. He died on the 29th of December 1931 at Claude Road, Drumcondra, his final removal.
Soft morning city, lisp. I am leafy spiefing. Faulty and faulty, all the nights have falled unto long my hair. Lisp. Not a sound. No wind. No word. Too many words. Dazzling. Incomprehensible. Drawn from 17 languages. The words of James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, his last great work. In it, he wove a complex and bewitching tale, set around a simple Irish wake that takes place in a Dublin pub. But he managed, through his genius, to weave into it the history of Western civilization, the history of the world, the history of ancient civilizations, the history of language, the history of man, woman, child, and their relationship to life and death, and all in a dreamlike sequence that speaks to us in a way that none of us quite understand, but has more to do with our inner selves and our inner lives and our souls' lives than it has to do with our conscious awareness. It's complex language. And his heroine of the story, he personified his river Liffey, the Liffey that flows through his own native city, Dublin. He called her Anna Livia Plurabella. And in the very end of the book, she speaks and tells her story. The book tells the story of her life, her family, her children, her loves, her hopes, her waywardness, how she dresses herself up for her suitors, how she beguiles them, her terrors and her fears. And in the end, she flows back into the sea, from which she will turn into vapor and eventually turn into rain, only to fall again, and the whole cycle is repeated. So the whole book is circular. This was Joyce's great pursuit, the pursuit of the circle, the ball, something that keeps turning and repeating itself. This is the mouth of the River Liffey, high in the Dublin mountains, overlooking Joyce's native city. From here, she will move on down into the city, weaving her way, spreading out her children, embracing the countryside, and telling her story as she goes. Little old-fashioned mummy, little wonderful mummy,
ducking under bridges, bell-hopping the weirs, dodging by a bit of bog, rapid-shooting round the bends, by Tallagh's green hills and the pools of the Fuca, and the place they call it Blessington, and slipping sly by Sally Noggin, as happy as the day is wet, babbling, bubbling, chattering to herself, deludering the fields on their elbows leaning with the sleuthering slide of her giddy-gaddy granny ma, gossipacious Anna Livia. He lifts the life wand and the dumb speak. So soft this morning. Hours. Yes, carry me along, Taddy, like you done through the toy fair. If I seen him bearing down on me now, under white spread wings like he'd come from archangels, I think I'd die down over his feet, humbly, dumbly, only to wash up. Yes, Tid. There's where. First, we passed by grass, we hushed the bush to whoosh. Gulls, far calls, coming far. End here. Us then, Finnegan, take but softly, remember me, till thousands thee loose. The keys to away, alone, a last, a loved, a long be. River run, past Eve and Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environs.